All right. Well, I appreciate the invitation to speak with you today and present. I'm Jared Smith from WebAIM. WebAIM stands for Web Accessibility in Mind. I'm going to go ahead and I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to try to put my slides up. I will invite you to post questions at any time. I think when I present full screen, though, I can't see the screen with the chat, and so I'll try to just jump back and forth a little bit, or Jennifer, you can jump in and interrupt me, or anybody can jump in just by voice if you have questions or comments along the way. I will stop it a few times at least and ask for questions. We're a small group, so I want to make sure I'm doing my best to answer any questions that you might have. So, WebAIM, as I mentioned, is the Web Accessibility in Mind project. We're based at the Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University. So while we're based at the university, we function as a consultancy and provide web accessibility services for entities all over the world. We work with small nonprofits to Fortune 100 corporations. We've worked with clients like PayPal and Ticketmaster, eBay, Bank of America, Amazon, things like that. A lot of clients that have websites that you use, many of you probably every day. And our goal is to help them make their websites more accessible to people with disabilities. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit of an introduction to this topic and some resources and tools that might help you in your web accessibility efforts. So when we think about web accessibility for people with disabilities, when we ask on like national censuses about disability, we know that about 20% of the population overall has a disability. That 20% number holds up pretty well for almost any country in the world. And if you think about that, that's over 1 billion people on the planet that have some form of disability. In many ways, it's one of the largest disadvantaged groups that are out there. And interestingly, it's also one that any of us can join at any moment in time. Statistically, most of us will experience a disability at some point in our lives. Most of those are age-related, but most of us will experience disability. And that is one thing that motivates me in the work that I do every day, is that by making the web more accessible to people with disabilities today, I'm really making it more accessible to my future self. As we analyze the types of disabilities that are reported, about 8.5% of the population has a disability that could impact their ability to use a computer or a mobile device. So that'll include visual disabilities, blindness, low vision, and color blindness, auditory disabilities, so deafness and hard of hearing, motor disabilities, difficulty maybe using a mouse or inability to use a mouse or a touchpad or other types of interactions with a computer. Also included in those with disabilities or those with cognitive and learning disabilities. Now, this 8.5% of the population that I am showing here does not include those with cognitive and learning disabilities. It doesn't include those with color blindness. Really only includes those that kind of major types of disabilities that tend to be reported on census and other types of data collection mechanisms. So this is a very minimal number, this 8.5%. And when you think about accessibility and making digital content accessible to this population, you have to ask, is it worth it? What does this 8.5% mean? Is that reasonable? How much effort is it going to take to make it accessible for the benefits for this particular audience? And those are important questions. We have to be practical and realistic in our implementation of accessibility. But most of all, what I want to stress is that we're talking about people. And it's easy for accessibility to just focus on technologies and guidelines and code and percentages. But ultimately, it's about people. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, is about the human experience of accessibility. Now, one interesting example of accessibility is the iPhone. When the iPhone was first released, it had very good accessibility built into it for users with disabilities. If you were blind, you could use this device. Even though it was entirely touchscreen driven, was very accessible to blind users. So if you were blind and you wanted a really cool phone, were you going to purchase an iPhone, or would you purchase a phone that you couldn't use because it was inaccessible to you? Of course you're going to buy an iPhone. And we saw in just a few short years a very significant shift in the disability community to iPhones and iPads, and now iPhones and iPads and MacBook Pros. We know from survey data that we collect at WebAIM the usage of iOS devices is significantly higher in the disability community than the overall population. So maybe Apple was seeing dollar signs in that decision to implement accessibility. The reality is that this accessibility has had a significant impact on the lives of individuals with disabilities. I have blind friends and colleagues that have said that the iPhone is the single most impactful, life-changing thing that has come along for them ever. And that's pretty amazing, I think. I love my iPhone, but I don't think I could really say that it has been that significantly life-changing. So Apple, I think with accessibility, they don't view those with disabilities, that 8.5%, as an opportunity to expand their reach to that 8.5%. And accessibility does do that. If it's inaccessible, those with disabilities can't come to it. But I think they see accessibility as more than that. They know that by implementing accessibility, those with disabilities will come to them. They will buy Apple devices, and they have. And we know that those with disabilities represent a notable part of Apple's market share. So again, maybe they were seeing dollar signs, but it's had a big impact. So I think as you see that 8.5%, don't just view it as an opportunity to expand your reach to that audience by implementing accessibility, but those with disabilities can and will come to places online that are accessible to them. Now, Android and others have come along and now have good accessibility, but Apple was there first. As we look at other cases of physical accessibility and relate them to digital accessibility, there's some interesting analogies and comparisons that we can make with public transportation. So when the Americans with Disabilities Act first passed, it required accessibility of public transportation, of buses. And you had the people that built the buses, manufactured the buses, and people that ran the public transportation systems saying things like, why do we need to make our buses accessible to wheelchair users? Wheelchair users don't ride our buses. And, well, yeah, of course they don't, because they couldn't, right? They were totally inaccessible to them. So we need to be careful with some of those those false assumptions about people with disabilities. But very often with digital accessibility, that's where we start. We're not very accessible. Do we have people with disabilities that use our stuff? And if not, why? That's important. Next, in the progression with buses, what we saw was instead of actually changing the buses, they introduced kind of this accommodation model where we're going to change the factors of things external to that bus, to that environment itself, and try to get people with disabilities into this thing that is inherently inaccessible. This photo shows somebody, lifting this guy up on a forklift and putting him into this inaccessible bus. And is this really accessible? I don't know. I mean, it's better, I guess, than no access, but accommodations are quite different. It doesn't really make the environment accessible. It tries to adapt to that user in some other way. Accommodations are very often delayed or very slow. And the reality is they're not equivalent. The experience for somebody riding the bus, this bus that has a motor disability, is quite different from anybody else. Next in the progression, we see retrofitting. So they took cutting torches and they cut a hole in the side of this bus and bolted on this hydraulic ramp. This was certainly much better, better accessibility, but it was still rather clunky and kind of expensive and probably not very equitable. If you were on the bus and you saw somebody at the stop in a wheelchair, you probably would assume you're going to be late. It was very slow to get somebody into and back off of this bus. Now, retrofitting for web accessibility is very often a reality. but it doesn't work very well. If you have something that has inherent accessibility issues, to try to retrofit and adapt and fix that, it's possible it can get better. But because that system was not inherently designed for accessibility, it's not going to work terribly well. Really, what we want to get to is universal accessibility. Many or most public buses these days have, they're very accessible. Our public transportation up here in Cache Valley, the buses will kneel or lower, so there's just one step to come into the main area of the bus. The driver can hit a button, a ramp will fold down, and somebody in a wheelchair independently, more than one wheelchair user at a time, can get on and off that bus. And they do it pretty much the same way as anybody else. And because that our buses now have been designed for accessibility, they just work. It's much easier, and the side effect of that is the buses are much better for everyone. There are many additional benefits. This photo shows a gentleman, pushing his child in a stroller off the bus. Probably not a disability, but because of that universal accessibility, it works much, much better for everyone. So that's the progression that we see with clients, ranging from we're not accessible, why would somebody with a disability come to our website, to really good, beautiful, inherent, built-in accessibility and universal design. So I think it's useful to view accessibility as a continuum, as a process, as something that can always be improved. And that's because accessibility is about the human experience, and humans are incredibly diverse. And so, anytime somebody comes to me and says my website is accessible, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to me. We have to quantify that. Accessible to whom? Accessible to what level? And, I think that viewing accessibility as a continuum is empowering. It allows us to really put our focus on that human experience. There are other aspects of web technology and design and stuff that we view the same way. Usability, security. It's not like you would say, oh yeah, our site's 100% usable. Well, what does that mean? Or oh yeah, we considered security and we did an audit. We're good on security. We don't ever have to think about that again. Now that's not the case, because the technology of security is changing all the time, as is the technology of accessibility. So this is always evolving, and I think that that's empowering to view accessibility in those ways. So I'm going to stop real quick, just see if there are any questions or comments about what I've shared to this point. Again, feel free to jump in at any point in time. Oh, okay, good question there. What initially got me interested in getting into the web accessibility field? Well, I've been doing this for a long time. WebAIM has been around for 20 years. We're just celebrating our 20th year right now. I've been with WebAIM over 18 years. I actually had a teaching degree at Utah State University, went and taught a little bit, came back to get a master's degree. And I was doing web design, web development, Cold Fusion, actually. If any of you new folks, you probably don't even know what that is. But I was doing a bunch of web stuff, and WebAIM had started just a year or two before across the hall, and it aligned with my interest of teaching and training. I've had an opportunity with WebAIM to train tens of thousands of people all over the world. It aligned with my interest in technology and web. And so I talked them into bringing me on, and they haven't been able to get rid of me. So it's worked out really, really well, and it's meaningful work. So that's I guess what got me first interested and what has kept me in this field. Thank you. That's a good question. Any others? Okay. All right, so while we view accessibility as this continuum, there are guidelines that provide measures along that continuum to help us measure where we're at. The primary set of guidelines or measures for accessibility are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I may say WCAG, WCAG. If I say WCAG, that's what I mean, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are an international set of guidelines formulated by the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, the standards body that creates the rules for the web. They define HTML and CSS and these other things that we use to build the web. They have a set of guidelines for accessibility. The first version of these guidelines was finalized in 1999. They're not new. We've had these things for a very long time. They have been revised over time. The current version is version 2.1, was finalized in 2018. And they're currently working on a version 2.2 of those guidelines, as well as kind of a 3.0, a significant update to these guidelines. Now, these guidelines are they're kind of academic. They're written to be very principles-based and technology agnostic. So if you read the guidelines, they don't tell you, you know, this is how you make an HTML form accessible. It talks about more characteristics of accessibility and what that form needs to do in order to work for people with disabilities. And that's worked really well because it's allowed these guidelines to have a fairly long shelf life. As technology changes, because these are principles-based, they tend to apply pretty well. The difficulty is that they're pretty ethereal and kind of difficult to understand and confusing if you just read the guidelines. At WebAIM, we have a checklist that takes a bunch of this academic, really lengthy technical speak from the W3C and boils it down to a fairly basic checklist. It's still 5 or 6 pages long, but it's the most significant, important aspects of those guidelines boiled down to a checklist. That's freely available on the webaim.org website. So that might be something that you can use as a good resource to not only help you implement the accessibility guidelines, but also to evaluate websites to those guidelines. The 4 foundational principles of these guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. POUR, there are poor principles. We're going to build poor websites. That'll help you remember it. Remember these principles. These are good principles, I think, to think about because they are really about that human experience. Can somebody perceive your content? Can they get it to their senses in a way that they can start to do something useful or meaningful with it? If content's not perceivable, it doesn't matter what else it is, it's going to be inaccessible to that user. Once you can perceive content, you want to be able to operate or navigate and use that content. It needs to be understandable and make sense. And it needs to be robust. It needs to work in the technologies that your end users are using, including assistive technologies that may be used by those with disabilities. So these are really good, I think, to just ask these questions, look at these principles for web content to see if it actually works for those with disabilities. Now, this is the very highest level principles for the guidelines. There's a lot more detail to these, but I think these can be a really good starting point. I think sometimes even before we consider accessibility, though, it's helpful to take a step back and consider usability. I use a phrase sometimes, web accessibility lipstick on a usability pig. If you have something that has inherent usability issues, no amount of accessibility techniques or code are going to fix those usability issues. It's still going to be a pig. So very often we work with our clients on usability. You know, how can we make this thing more intuitive, more friendly, more efficient first? And then when we do that, the accessibility tends to come much, much easier. Whereas if we have inherent usability issues, it's just going to be unusable, or at least less usable and more difficult to make accessible. So I think that that's a kind of a higher level principle for us to really consider. When it comes to legal guidelines and requirements, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the foundational civil rights law for those with disabilities in the United States. It doesn't say the word web or internet anywhere in it. It predates the web. Instead, it just talks about non-discrimination for those with disabilities or against those with disabilities. The ADA covers employment, which is really important. It's very often overlooked. You know, don't overlook the accessibility of like HR systems, intranets, things like that, because employment is very clearly covered by the ADA. Covers state and local governments, which would include education, and covers public and commercial facilities, which is really pretty much any place where the public can congregate, shopping malls, theaters, things like that. So the question for some time has been, is the web a place of public accommodation? Is it, in other words, can an inaccessible website be considered discriminatory under the ADA? The predominant answer is yes, it can be. We have case law, we have clarification from the Department of Justice, which enforces the ADA, that says yes, the web is covered by the ADA. It needs to be accessible, or at least not discriminatory. Where this gets tricky, however, is that there currently are no technical standards defined in the ADA. We do have those for other things. The ADA requires accessible buildings like wheelchair ramps, and wheelchair ramps can only be so steep, and doors have to be so wide, and drinking fountains at a specific height, things like that. We have those technical standards for physical accessibility, but we don't yet have those for the web. With all of that said, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have in many ways become the de facto standard. They're the ones that are being referenced in lawsuits, and the number of lawsuits under the ADA have the numbers have significantly increased in recent years. Just last year, there were about 4,000 federal lawsuits under the ADA regarding digital accessibility. So your websites need to be accessible, even though the ADA does not specifically indicate that they must or provide technical guidelines for those. There are other laws that are out there. Section 508 is one that applies to the federal government. There is somebody, I just asked if you would mute your phones, if y'all just check that, or your lines real quick. Thank you. So anyway, there are legal requirements out there. Now, I would say, however, that your site can be compliant yet still be inaccessible. If these guidelines just provide a measure along that continuum, you could reach that threshold of accessibility, yet still have users with disabilities that may have difficulty accessing that content. Could it still be considered discriminatory if you meet a set of guidelines, yet somebody still can't get to your stuff? I'm not a lawyer, but perhaps. And to take this a step further, your site can be technically accessible, yet functionally inaccessible. So as an example of this, I think for just a minute about a website that you have built or that you're very familiar with. For somebody with a motor disability that may have difficulty using a mouse or a touchpad, very often they will interact with a web page using the keyboard or technology that emulates the keyboard. You can hit the tab key on the keyboard to navigate through interactive elements on a web page through links and form control, starting at the top of the page and then navigating through anything in that page that's interactive. So think for a moment about your page. How many times would you have to hit the tab key from the top of the page, maybe through the logo, main navigation, maybe there's a drop down or fly out menu, maybe search functionality, maybe there's a sidebar, that all come before the main content area. It might be a few times hitting that key, but probably it's quite a few. We've seen as many as 600 navigation items on a web page that the user would have to tab through, hitting the tab key, one per item. So something like that could be considered technically accessible. The guidelines simply say you need to make your things work for keyboard users, and it does, I guess, right? The user can use the keyboard to get to everything. But is that functionally accessible? Would somebody really hit the tab key 600 times? I think of a colleague that we had that had paraplegia, very limited mobility below the neck, and he used a kind of a wand or a stick in his mouth to press the keys on the keyboard. And it would be very tiring and tedious for him to hit that tab key 600 times to go through a navigation on a website and really every single page on that website before he could get to the good stuff, the main content area of that page. So really what this means is that we want to focus on the end user experience. We want to focus on accessibility over strict compliance. We want to use guidelines, as tools, as resources to help us understand where we're at when it comes to accessibility. with the understanding that guidelines don't ensure a positive end user experience. They just support it. Okay, I'm going to stop again. If there are any questions about the law or at a high level, the web content accessibility guidelines or any of these principles, now is your chance. Okay, Jennifer has a question. What percentage of sites would you say pass ADA standards? Okay, that's actually a really good and very timely question. At WebAIM 1 year ago, just over a year ago, we conducted an analysis of the home pages for the top 1 million websites. So we used automated tools, Wave, that I'll talk about a little bit later, to perform an automated analysis of 1 million homepages and collected lots and lots of accessibility data on those. I just reanalyzed 1 million homepages in the last few weeks, and just today I'm working on our updated report sharing the findings of what we found. When it comes to compliance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, the failure rate is 98%. That means is that even using automated tools, which can really only detect about 35 to 40% of overall compliance failures and accessibility issues, we detected that 98% of sites do not comply with even the foundational level of requirement for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the short answer of that is almost all of them do not pass ADA standards. And again, ADA standards or ADA compliance is a little bit of a misnomer. It's just because the ADA itself does not define those. But talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, yeah, very few sites do. This time, the last few weeks, I also analyzed well over 100,000 other pages. So beyond just the home pages, we went deeper into the web sites for the top up to 100 pages on the top 1,300 websites, and similar results. The compliance level was very, very low. And even more impactful, I think, is that on average, a user can expect to encounter 60 distinct elements or instances of non-compliance on the average homepage. So imagine you looking at a homepage visually and 60 things on that homepage disappeared. And that's kind of the experience that many might experience with disabilities. It's a little bit of an overstatement. Because there are various types of disabilities, and each of those may have different types of impact on the user. But yeah, wow, that's bad is the comment in the chat. And yeah, it really kind of is. It's frustrating. We have a lot of work to do for accessibility. My hope with my career and what I'm taking the time to talk to you about today is that maybe we can make things a little bit better. Any other questions? Okay, what should small business owners and developers be asking themselves in regards to web accessibility? Okay, that's a good question. It's a big question. I think the biggest one is just to ask the question first. What about accessibility? Especially for a small business owner, this can pose some interesting challenges. If 98% of homepages have significant accessibility issues, how do you start to address that? A lot of it is tooling. Most of it, however, I think is education and knowledge, considering accessibility. For developers, there's there's a fair amount involved to make things accessible. As you consider costs to implement accessibility are always going to be a function of your knowledge. I think it's that way for any development practice, right? I couldn't, if I ask you to build a React driven web application, the cost is going to be a lot more if you don't know anything about React, right? Whereas if you do, that cost is going to be a lot less because you come to the table with that foundation of knowledge. Same thing with accessibility. So I don't know, those are a few things, but I think the biggest one is just consideration of this and giving it a meaningful amount of attention, whether it's in the content management system that you use, the third-party provider, the developers that are used. Yes, as the comment says, education is key. It really is when it comes to accessibility and implementing this. Are there, so Sean asked the question, are there any easy to use tools one could obtain to implement in their websites like Bootstrap or React? I'm going to talk about evaluation tools a little bit later. Many of the frameworks and libraries that are out there like Bootstrap, React, things like that have a lot of accessibility built into them. Some of them more than others. That's one thing you can actually read on our WebAIM Million report. And our findings are fully published. They're available on the webaim.org site. We actually provide data about the correspondence of particular tools like Bootstrap or React or Angular or WordPress or jQuery, or there was about 100 of them, and how those things correspond with increases or decreases in detectable accessibility errors. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that technology causes those errors, but there's a very strong correspondence. So there are tools that are better to support accessibility, but I think even regardless of the tool, it really does come back to education. Most of these tools that are used will support accessibility. It's just a lack of understanding and effort and consideration in that accessibility, in implementing that accessibility with that particular tool. So there isn't, unfortunately, there's not like one silver bullet. Oh yeah, just use this tool and your accessibility is done. It has to be a little more intentional than that. Okay, good questions. Feel free to just keep posing those questions in chat as I go here. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we can do to actually start to address accessibility and make it a little bit better. I'm going to structure this based on those 4 principles that we talked about, the first being perceivable. For users with auditory disabilities, you would provide captions for video and live audio. So this is for somebody with deafness or hard of hearing who may not be able to hear the audio content of multimedia from, say, a YouTube video or a podcast or MP3 file. So captions for video and live audio, text transcripts for all audio content. That's pretty much it. A text transcript would be the written text version of everything that's spoken in the media, as well as any other important information like audio cues, music, explosion, laughter, or visual only information, maybe something that it is in a YouTube video that appears visually that's not conveyed via audio. Those would also be included in that descriptive text transcript. Pretty easy to understand, not so easy to actually implement, but this is the foundational things that WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, would require for those with auditory disabilities. For those with visual disabilities, again, blindness, low vision, and color blindness, or more technically, more accurately, color deficiency, quite a few things to consider. One is sufficient contrast, so enough brightness difference between text and the background to that text. Now, these slides are white on a very dark gray background to ensure sufficient contrast. A lot of modern websites and web applications have a dark gray on a lighter gray background, and we all struggle with insufficient contrast. It can be more impactful for users with certain visual disabilities. The guidelines have measures for sufficient contrast. We have a tool on the WebAIM site where you can put in a foreground color value, a background color value, and it will tell you how that particular color combination aligns with the Web Content Accessibility Guideline contrast requirements. So there are a lot of great tools. Chrome Developer Tools has contrast checking indications built right into it. So you can see, with this foreground color, this background color, how those colors align with the guidelines. So really important, especially for those with visual disabilities, but important for everyone. We also want to be careful that we don't convey meaning or information using color alone. So we can use color for sure. There's few things that are impactful on visual design for accessibility that are not beneficial for everybody. Very, very few. In fact, I would probably say none. So occasionally there's a little tension between accessibility and visual design, but we typically can resolve those by focusing on usability first. But you know, for somebody that may have color blindness where they have difficulty differentiating between certain colors, someone that is blind that can't see colors at all, somebody with low vision that may change the colors on their screen, the colors of text, into a combination that works better for their visual disability, that color information can be lost. So use color, just don't use color as the only way to indicate important things, like maybe a red border around a text input that is in an error state. If all you're doing is changing the color of that border to indicate the error, somebody may not be able to visually discern that simple color change. An icon, text, something else in addition to that color would avoid that color reliance issue. For those that are blind, that will be using a screen reader that reads the text content to them, structure and semantics are the real big things that we focus on in our web design and development. So these are things like a logical heading structure, using H1 for first level headings, typically one per page, and then H2 for subheadings, H3 for sub-subheadings, and so forth, down to H6 for our sixth level heading. Really important. You know, when I come to a new web page, I scroll real fast and I look for big bold text. The bigger and bolder that text, the more significant of a heading that is. And by scrolling real fast and looking for that big bold text, I can really quickly get an understanding of the content and structure of that page. By using proper headings, as opposed to just say CSS to style text as being big and bold, we can provide that same functionality and ability to somebody that doesn't visually scan the page but is listening to it. Headings are identified in screen readers when they come to headings. And maybe more important, a screen reader user can navigate by headings within the page. So using those headings to define that structure of the page, kind of like a term paper with a title at the beginning and H1 and then subheadings and sub-subheadings, each that describe a section of content, that provides a really, really powerful way for a screen reader user to explore the content of that page and navigate the content of that page. We can also in HTML define regions, header for the stuff at the top of the page, nav for navigation areas, main for our main content area, aside for sidebars that are related to that main content, footer for the stuff at the bottom of our web page. We do the same things kind of visually. I scan through the design of the page. I'm like, oh, yeah, here's the top stuff. Oh, there's navigation. I'll probably come back to that later. Oh, here's the good stuff, main content. Oh, there's the sidebar. Here's the footer. And I visually parse that layout. And then when I come to subsequent pages, I remember that structure and I really quickly get to the things that I'm looking for, primarily the main content of that page. I don't read the navigation or header on every single page. I skip past it. By defining these elements in the code of our page, we provide screen reader users the same ability to navigate through those regions within that page. It's really, really important, very powerful, and pretty easy for us to add to existing web pages, and especially new ones. We can associate label text to form controls. So visually, if I see the words first name, and next to the words first name, I see a text box, I know that I put my first name into that text box because of the layout and proximity of the text to the input. Someone that's blind can't make that visual association based on proximity. So we can use the label element in HTML to explicitly associate the text first name with the input. Then when a screen reader user comes to that input, it would read the associated label text. This is the input for first name. You'll notice that almost all of this happens under the hood of the page. It's transparent to the visual design and the functionality for the most part. It's just code that it's structure and semantics that we add into the code of the page to facilitate better accessibility. One other thought on this, all of these things I'm talking about are also incredibly beneficial for search engine optimization, or at least search engine friendliness. Data table headers. Visually, you can scan a data table and find the column headers or the row headers for a particular data cell, but that's visual scanning. Someone that's blind can't do that visual scanning, but we can add a little bit of code that says, hey, this thing is a header for this column, this thing is a header for this row. And by doing that, we create associations between the cells and their appropriate headers, column headers or row headers or both. And those can be identified to a screen reader user and facilitate navigation through that. We can define a descriptive page title, the title element in HTML, the text that shows up in the tab in our browser. It's the first thing read by a screen reader. Needs to describe what that page is about, especially if the user has multiple tabs open, like most of us do, and you come back to that. We visually tend to use that title text to differentiate. A screen reader user would do the same thing. We need to identify the document language, the lang attribute on the HTML tag. Very easy. That's like, what was that, 12 characters, 13 characters, something like that. That ensures that a screen reader reads that document with the appropriate language pronunciation and intonation and language settings. Really important to add that. And these are things that are all required by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We can provide equivalent alternative text for non-text elements, especially images, just the alt attribute on image that presents the content of the image. And if the image has a function, what that function is. This is the shortest treatment I think I've ever given of alternative text. We have a very lengthy article on the WebAIM site about alternative text and most of these other techniques if you want to learn more. Having good, meaningful linked text, things like click here. It's ambiguous to everyone as to what that means. It's ambiguous to search engines, so it can't establish a relationship between that link and the page it's being linked to. So having good linked text is also really, really important. Okay, that was a bunch. I mentioned that 98% of pages have compliance failures. The vast majority of those fit into categories for the things that I've just described. If we just do the things that are on these two slides, the vast majority of those compliance failures, 60 million of them across the top 1 million homepages, the vast majority of those would go away, resulting in a much more accessible experience for those with disabilities. Okay, I heard a chat message come in. Let's see what you've got. If you've got any questions, again, please post those. Okay, Jennifer asked, how much extra time on average would you say that it adds to a project in order to make it accessible? Oh, okay. This is a common question, and it's really difficult to answer in some ways because there are a lot of variables. And it kind of goes back to that previous comment about education being a primary factor in that cost. And it's hard to tease out the cost of accessibility unless you're doing it wrong, right? Like you wouldn't, for instance, if you were having an architect build a building, you wouldn't say, tell me how much it costs to make this building. Oh, and then tell me how much more it costs to make it accessible. Because the building, if it's a public building, it has to be accessible. You wouldn't ask, well, build me a website and then tell me how much more it's going to cost to make it usable. Right? Kind of seems silly when we frame it that way, because if you're doing usability or security or physical accessibility, whatever it is, if you're doing it right, it's integrated into that entire process, and thus making it more difficult to define the actual cost for that component of it. With that said, accessibility is not free, but if you have a good sense for what accessibility is and how to implement it, it's much, much easier, much less expensive. You know, I get calls quite often from potential clients that say, you know, we're launching our site next week. Can you help us make it accessible? And at that point, it's not going to work very well. It's going to be more expensive because we're retrofitting. We're cutting with a cutting torch the hole in the side of the bus, and we're bolting on that hydraulic lift to try to make it accessible. And that comes with time and cost. On the other hand, when I have clients that say we're just starting initial requirements or design, we're going to rebuild this site, or we're building something new, we want to make it accessible with much, much more minimal effort, we can then integrate accessibility into that. This is something I'm going to come back to a little bit later. But I would say for entities that have a good understanding of accessibility, have the right tools, things like that, the cost really is for accessibility is pretty minimal. It's so hard to throw out a number because it varies so much based on the site and the complexity and everything else. But I don't know, maybe 5%, somewhere in that range, I think is really what it would cost. We have, on the other hand, found with clients that implement that accessibility in those ways, the returns significantly outweigh the cost for implementing it. They're getting a broader audience, they're addressing usability needs, they're minimizing their legal risk, they're reviewing, minimizing time in review and bug fixing. They have a better code base that's semantically sound. They have practices for developers that are supporting accessibility, which improves efficiency. There's just a lot of additional benefits that tend to outweigh those direct costs for accessibility. It's a really good question. It was a long answer. But hopefully that is at least a little bit of an answer for you. Okay, I'll jump back again. Keep the questions coming. I'll go through some of these next ones pretty quickly. For operability, this primarily impacts those with motor disabilities. I'm going to skip a few slides here. I think I'm going to cover this one real quick. So there are two photos here. The one on the left shows a wheelchair ramp. There's a wheelchair sign or placard for this ramp that goes up into this to this entrance of a building. On the right-hand side is this ground level revolving door. And there's accessibility built into this ground level revolving door. A few things. One, there are sensors in the door. So if you were in a wheelchair and were trying to get through that entrance, or maybe you had crutches or a walker or a small child or something like that, the door isn't going to force you through at its pace. It'll actually kind of stop and slow down and move with you. There's also a button on the right-hand side. In this case, if you push the button, the door stops. The right-hand side of that has folded open. And so if you're in a wheelchair, you can actually just go directly through that revolving door, through that entrance that has been made. So both of these provide accessibility. I would argue that the one on the right is probably a better approach to accessibility because it has that native accessibility built into it. Now, the wheelchair ramp can also provide accessibility. But there are a few things, especially about this particular wheelchair ramp. Visually, it doesn't really match the building. In fact, you can tell this ramp was almost certainly added after the building was made. It's probably, the building was probably built pre-ADA. The ramp, the color doesn't match. It juts out into the sidewalk. It just doesn't fit very well. It has kind of this weird lip at the bottom. There are additional benefits to that wheelchair ramp. I can push my kid in the stroller up there. The delivery person can use that ramp. But kind of what it suggests is if you have a disability, this is your way of getting into the building. Whereas the ground level revolving door, everybody uses the same entrance. And that entrance is designed to simply adapt to the needs of the user. That's where we want to get with web accessibility. We want to build it naturally and beautifully into our existing designs and user experience and have it be adaptable to the end user's needs. Okay, so it's kind of a little philosophical discussion there. Sometimes we see this approach of, we'll create a separate version for those with disabilities, or here's our accessible version or our screen reader optimized version of this application. We would advise against that. First of all, it has this indication of being separate. Very often they're not kept up to date. It's more work to maintain two versions of those things. It's just most often not necessary. We also know from users with disabilities that they tend not to use those. Imagine being in a wheelchair, and to get into your favorite restaurant, you have to go through the kitchen, right? Around back and up the ramp and through the kitchen. And is that very friendly? Are you likely to really enjoy that experience? Probably not. Building it in naturally into that experience is much better. So for operability, a few things ensure things work with a keyboard. So put your mouse away, don't use your touchpad, just use your keyboard, interact with things within that page. As you're hitting the tab key to navigate through things on the page, the browser by default will provide a visual highlight. Most browsers do kind of a blue halo. Firefox does a little dashed outline around the currently focused element, the thing that I'm on that I can interact with using the keyboard. You can, with just a little bit of CSS, you can turn off that focus indicator or outline. Don't do that. It's really, really bad for those with motor disabilities that rely on that using the keyboard. Make sure that you can tell what things you can interact with. Make sure your reading order for a screen reader user, your navigation order for keyboard users is logical and intuitive. Usually that means left to right, top to bottom through the page. We want to make things understandable. This will impact those with cognitive or learning disabilities, the largest disability group out there, probably larger than all the others that I've talked about put together, and it impacts everyone. So we want to be careful with movement or other distractors. Some people have very high levels of distractibility, and that automatically advancing carousel or that background video or that animating image on a page can render the rest of the page content totally inaccessible because you can't ignore it. We want to simplify, be consistent. Be careful with really small text. Those with cognitive disabilities tend to struggle with that. Well, everybody does, but they tend to struggle with it a little bit more. Be careful with our line lengths. Too many characters per line has an impact. Too few characters per line also introduces some overhead. Use good design, white space, color, fonts, typography, just good visual design to focus the users on the things that are most important. Chunking or simplifying content. Using headings to break up large sections of text. Maybe instead of one really long form that's complex, maybe breaking it into a simpler multi-step process, like an Amazon.com checkout flow, right? It's probably too easy because there are Amazon boxes on my porch like every day, right? But think of how easy and how cognitively simple they have made that task that can otherwise be quite complex on many websites to buy something and get it to your place, right? A lot of this is balancing cognitive load and functionality. The guidelines don't do a whole lot in this area of understandability. A lot of this, there's a lot of overlap with usability, and a lot of it's just common sense. Okay, then our final principle is robust. This is technology strength. Does it actually work in the technologies that your users use, including those with disabilities? Okay, so that was a pretty quick introduction to those 4 principles. And along with this, I think if we think about these 4 principles and we think about the needs of users with disabilities and how we can best address those, we're going to have a really good approach to accessibility, and we're going to build something that's reasonably going to work for them. So I have this phrase that I use sometimes, that accessibility paves the cow paths. So I grew up in Idaho on a farm, and cows take the path of least resistance from point A to point B, as do university students. We're based at Utah State University. This photo on the right here is one that I took on just a block from my office. You can see where the students cut the corner across the grass to save 1 second getting to class. And that's that natural behavior. It's the most efficient behaviors to cut that corner. And so the idea of paving the cow paths, or paving the paths in this case, is to, as they've done in this case, right where that dirt path was, they put in stepping stones. Actually, after I took this photo, they took those out. They put in like a little bit wider, tighter stones that look a lot nicer. And then just a year or so ago, I noticed at this exact place, they actually paved it. They just took out the grass and dirt and those stepping stones, and they put in concrete to support that natural, efficient behavior of the user, of the student on campus. And that's what we want with accessibility. Here's another photo I took this one by our main library. You can see there's a path that goes across the grass for, say 5 or 10 seconds. I remember every year they put up like these poles and a rope and a sign that says, please don't walk on the grass. And it's really like a matter of minutes. And there's a path that goes around that. Shortly after I took this photo, I noticed this construction going on at this location, and I wasn't quite sure what they were doing, if they were adding on to the building. This is the reverse shot. There's the path that goes right into that construction zone. And when they were done, this is what they had built. And I want you to think, why? Why did they tear out trees and grass and put in this little concrete short wall? The only thing I can think of is, get off my lawn, kids. that's really it. This is the antithesis of paving the cow path. This is trying to inhibit that natural behavior. And I have seen students jump over this thing and go across the grass. So it still doesn't do a very good job, I think, of what it was intended to do. Very often we view accessibility as a constraint, and it is. Everything in design, everything in user experience is built within constraints. Everything we build on the web has constraints, and we have to function within those, and accessibility is no different. Those constraints give us power. They ensure accessibility and a good end user experience and facilitate so many of the other things that we've talked about, a good developer experience, search engine friendliness, and they support good innovation. And so I want you to go out and build really cool, amazing things. Just integrate the accessibility, and it's going to be much better and support that natural behavior of efficiency. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second, see if there are any. I went through quite a bit of stuff there, but are there any questions about any of those things, those topics? Okay. Not seeing any there, so I'm going to take just a couple more minutes and wrap up with a couple thoughts, and then I'll take time at the end for questions. I want to just introduce you briefly to Wave. Wave is a web accessibility evaluation tool that we have built at WebAIM. It's freely available at wave.webaim.org. It just allows you to, I'm going to try this real quick. Hopefully I'm sharing this. You can go to wave.webaim.org, put in a website address. I'm actually going to analyze and check the meetup page for this event. I don't know how this will work. We'll give it a go. I can put in the website address, hit the button. What Wave will do is it will show you, oh, interesting, I got a weird redirect. That's okay. It will show you the original page and inject icons and indicators into that page to give you feedback about accessibility. It'll identify accessibility errors. These are things that even an automated tool knows are going to introduce accessibility issues and compliance failures. There are contrast errors when text within a page does not provide sufficient contrast. There are alerts, which are orange icons. Those indicate things that the tool does not know cause an accessibility issue, but it's something as a human you really need to look at. I mentioned before, tools can detect maybe 35 to 40% of total compliance issues. These alerts are primarily in that other 60 to 65%, things that as a human you need to look at. And that's a lot of the power of Wave, is it facilitates that human evaluation process. There are green icons that indicate accessibility features, like, for instance, this is a linked image with alternative text. Those are things that are probably good for accessibility, but as a human, you should probably take a look at them to make sure that they've been done correctly. There are structural elements. Those are a lot of the things that I was talking about. Headings and regions, lists, tables, things like that are identified as structural elements. And then there's ARIA. ARIA is a specification that allows you to essentially extend HTML to support better accessibility, primarily for screen reader users. There's a lot more to ARIA, but Wave also identifies things that are present in ARIA. For instance, an ARIA alert or live region. That's something with ARIA where you can have a screen reader read information as an alert. Like kind of force the screen reader to read something right now. So there's a lot of additional functionality in Wave. You can see all of the individual things within Wave. You can click on any icon to get additional information. For instance, here's a linked image missing alternative text. So that image right here, if a screen reader user were to encounter it, there would be no text available for that screen reader user to know what this image is for. It would say probably link image. It might read the image file name or something, but it should have alternative text of download on the App Store. Contrast errors. These are instances of text that do not meet the contrast requirements. There's a contrast tab here, and you can see the foreground and background color and see how those align with the contrast requirements within the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's additional documentation, so you can go to the reference panel in Wave and see details about everything that's showing up in Wave. You can see the structure for a page. So all of those regions and the headings that I talked about, you can see all of those kind of in isolation within that page. You can click on any icon in the sidebar to jump right to it within the page. So that's a little bit about Wave. There's a lot of other functionality in there. There's a code panel where you can actually see the underlying code to see what's happening under the hood that's causing a particular thing, indicator, or icon in Wave to show up. So that's a really quick introduction to Wave. We have a Chrome and Firefox extension version of Wave. You can install it right into Chrome and Firefox, do the testing right in your browser. That can be helpful for password protected pages, intranet pages, things on your local system. Also really highly dynamic, JavaScript driven pages and applications can be easily analyzed using the Chrome or Firefox Wave extension. So that's one tool. I'll leave you with, these are all freely available. We also have an API if you want to check a whole bunch of pages. We have an API where you can get that accessibility data. So anyway, hopefully that's one thing that you can take that might be a little helpful to you as you implement accessibility. This is one quick slide I'll cover. Just, we talked about this a little bit before, but just that idea that the later we introduce accessibility efforts in the design development process, the more expensive it's going to be. This is called BEMS curve. It is, we want to start early. It's going to be much less expensive. We wait until testing, or heaven forbid it's in production, to start to address accessibility issues. The effort for change is going to be much, much, much higher than building it in the right way from the beginning. Okay, I want to end with this quote. For people without disabilities, technology makes things convenient, whereas for people with disabilities, it makes things possible. I love this. I think the web in some ways is the great equalizer for those with disabilities. The power of the web is that it can be accessed in ways that are so adaptable and flexible to the end user and their needs. Somebody can take the time that they need, using the technology that they need, adapting content in ways that they need, and just make it work as long as that accessibility is in place. And we often view accessibility as a function of the person, right? That person is disabled. And it's helpful, I think, and maybe better for us to view accessibility as a function of the environment. If you think about it, if somebody is blind, it doesn't matter if they're blind accessing your website, if you've integrated that accessibility. If you have not made that site accessible, then the fact that they're blind suddenly becomes relevant, right? In some ways, you introduced that disability, or the website introduced that disability that was not there before, because the web inherently is accessible unless we break it. And so that's our job as people that are doing web stuff, is to not break it, to not disable our users. It's our job to make things just work. So the web is, I think, the great equalizer. And if anything, this has been made very, very apparent in the last few weeks as we consider how much has gone online, how many people have gone online and are now living in a much, much more digitally connected world. And many of the difficulties that people with disabilities have been warning us about and complaining about forever suddenly are becoming very apparent for a lot of us, because we're now thrown into that environment. And beyond just the technical difficulties, those disabilities also have a lot of accessibility difficulties as well, where accessibility hasn't been considered. And so I just think of the, here at our university, the tens of thousands of web pages that have been created in the last 2 weeks as we've gone entirely online, of jobs have gone remote. I think it's bringing a lot of visibility to accessibility, and I think I hope, at least in the coming weeks, months, and years, that we're going to be spending a lot more time thinking about accessibility, because this has brought some of those issues to light in recent days. So, okay, with that, I'll say thank you and open it up for any questions that you might have. I'm not seeing any, but you're welcome to go ahead and post. Otherwise, I really appreciate the invitation to present today, and hopefully it's been used.
Hey, Jared, sorry. There are actually a couple questions in there. I don't know if you're being updated.
Thank you. Yeah, I just needed to scroll. Thank you for the prompt. Okay. All right. So let me get to a few of these. All right. Thank you. All right. So Jennifer, you asked, as someone who is pretty new to programming, where's a good place to start in implementing accessibility into my work? Are there maybe a top 3 things that you'd recommend focusing on? Okay. As far as like places to start, the WebAIM site, I think we have a lot of resources and materials, articles to help get you started. If you have more technical questions about any of the things I've talked about and more, the WebAIM site can be helpful. Top 3 things. Well, I'm going to expand that a little bit and talk about top 5. The top 5 things that we detected on our million homepages also tend to be some of the most impactful. Those are insufficient contrast, missing or insufficient alternative text, missing form labels, so the text next to a control is not associated to that control, empty links and buttons. So if a link does not contain text, or a button does not contain text or have a value, then there's nothing to be read by a screen reader. So maybe it's just an image or a background image, but with no text to identify what the functionality of that link or button is. And missing document language. So that lang attribute, lang equals en on your HTML tag. Those are 5 things, very impactful. Probably maybe one more that I would add to that is basic keyboard testing, just using the tab key to navigate through a site. That's something that Wave can't really detect, but it's pretty easy for you to do testing on. So that'd be kind of my top 6, I guess, there to double your how many you asked for there. On the WebAIM site, we do have an accessibility testing quick reference. It's a 1-page. It covers a lot of the things that I talked about today. That'll also cover many of those top things that you can look for, test for, and fix on most web pages. Okay. What advice would you give to those that might be interested in pursuing a career in web accessibility? Well, this is a good one. There's a lot of demand for accessibility right now, and has been for some time. I think that is increasing, and I really suspect in the coming weeks and months and years, we're going to have even more of that. Accessibility is a great differentiator. For if you're a designer, a developer, a program manager, and you're trying to differentiate yourself from 10,000 of your peers that are all going to apply for that same job, accessibility is a really, really good differentiator. It's a great skill that's not very common, that a lot of people are looking for. So I'd say just expand your knowledge. There's online training, WebAIM. We offer 2 days of intensive training if you're looking for something more intense than what you just get online. You know, if you're really looking for a career, I think those are big ones. Become familiar with assistive technologies, and I'd say maybe along with that, become familiar with the culture of disability. You know, find those with disabilities, learn what their needs are, learn what technologies they're using. It makes it much more real and gives you a better sense of the impact that it might have on them. Okay. All right. And then the last question I see in here, 10 years from now, what would you hope is different with the tech community and accessibility? Wow, that's a good question. You know, I've been doing this 18 years, and most of the things that I talked about today are the same issues that we were facing 18 years ago. Alt text, contrast, form labels. I mean, it's the same issues we've had forever, and they're still the most common issues on the web. So 10 years from now, boy, I hope that statement I made of the web being the great equalizer is even more realized in 10 years. At least those foundational issues we will have nailed. I think a lot of that will come down to tooling. You know, if we get tools and frameworks that really address good accessibility, it's going to make our lives a lot easier in implementing this, instead of trying to fix the issues that are inherently introduced by whatever framework X, React, Angular, whatever. That those things become much more natural. That maybe they have systems in them to not only not break accessibility, but to support better accessibility. As an example of this, imagine if WordPress that powers the majority of the web, what if WordPress didn't let you, or at least at a minimum prompted you, if you tried to create something that was going to introduce significant accessibility barriers? How much better would the web be if everyone building a WordPress site knew that what they were building could cause issues? I think it would be so much better. And why not? Why aren't these tools doing those types of things? I think that's a direction that we can move to. You know, the innovation is just getting faster and faster. Web is a really hot topic in accessibility, VR, AR, things like that. These are interesting questions that we're addressing. Along with those, oh gosh, machine learning and artificial intelligence. Such amazing potential, I think, there for those with disabilities. I just hope that the gap between that innovation and accessibility is shortened significantly in the next 10 years. I always hate this question. Sorry, Jennifer. What are some of the most well-done sites you've seen as far as accessibility? Any of note that are especially bad? This is always a tough one, because it seems like anytime I call out a good site that it gets worse, and anytime I call out a bad site, somebody smacks me and I get in trouble. You know, one thing I just a thought I would note on this, but maybe before I try somewhat of an answer. We know from survey data that we conduct of those with disabilities that many and most of them tend to prefer mobile experiences to web-based experiences. In other words, if I need to shop online or check my bank account or those types of things, most of them tend to go to the mobile apps as opposed to the web experience, primarily because of accessibility and usability barriers. So if we think of the experiences we have on mobile, and maybe this mobile first mentality, where we start with the fundamental stuff and then we add to it on web, I think that can be kind of a powerful approach. So well done sites. Gosh, this is always a tough one. Our own site, how's that for a cop-out? WebAIM.org. We certainly try to do a lot with design and coding and best practice there. Hopefully that serves as a model. Apple does a lot of government sites. That's one thing we found through our million-page study. Government sites, university sites tend to be quite a bit better. Now, they still have a lot of issues because most sites are really bad, but they tend to be a lot better. Those that are really bad, most sites out there, again, have quite a few issues. So, but you don't need to apologize. I should probably just formulate a better answer to that, because it's always a little bit tricky question when I get it. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, the comment 49 commander says, yeah, I guess that the name there, I think with aging population, this would help them too. Absolutely. Yeah, as we, the age of those on the web is continually increasing. Yeah, this accessibility is going to become more and more apparent to all of us as we age. I think my grandmother, she's almost 80. And anytime I'm building or designing something, it's really helpful for me to take a step back and think, what is her experience going to be with this? And that helps me think better of accessibility, because eventually that's where, well, hopefully I'm going to be 80 someday too. Okay, I think we're about at time. No more questions that I see, but I'll just say thank you again, Jennifer, for the introduction, and hopefully this has been helpful to you.